All right, today we're going to talk about food, water, and cover. Make sure that you read the chapter for this paired with this lecture because I won't cover everything in detail, but questions will come from the chapter that I don't cover in this lecture and vice versa. So make sure you read that. First, I wanted to talk about nutritional ecology. This is something that's pretty important in our field to understand, and it's basically the science of relating an animal to its environment through nutritional interactions. And that can be more complicated than just finding food and eating it, right? So we're going to talk about some of those complexities. Ultimately, this is pretty important to understand so that you can understand survival, reproduction, and the life history of the animal in general, like we talked about last time with the gopher tortoise, understanding the life history and how it affects survival and reproduction through its nutritional ecology is a pretty important thing to manage those populations. So, normally when we're talking about nutritional ecology, the currency that is typically used is energy. So that's because all animals, including us, need energy and we use it in almost all of the processes that we're carrying out in the body, right? Energy is being expended to move and eat, and even just sitting still, your body is using energy to do the normal processes it's carrying out. So it's really important. Uh, Obviously, to understand animals' relationship with energy and the environment, and that might change based on their life history and what life stage they're in. For instance, these are poults from a wild turkey, and they have a much different nutritional demand than the adult does. Deer during antler growth or lactation have a much different nutritional demand than they do at other times of the year when they aren't doing those things in their life history. So it's important to understand that timing and how it relates over the lifespan of animals and also how it might change through the year. When we think about energy, we relate everything back to a basal metabolism, and that basal metabolism rate is basically how much energy is used when you're lying still, calm, you're fasted. So in other words, you haven't eaten anything in a while, and you don't have thermal stress. That is the basic amount of energy your body needs to just stay alive at that point. So that's pretty important. Generally, when we look at the environment, you can see this process with some of the Canis species. So that's coyote and wolf and some other species. But you can see generally the cold environment cost more to this species than the warm environment, right? So the basal metabolic rate is changing based on where they're at in their range. So if you know anything about the species, you'll know this is up at the very northern tip of their range, and this is kind of right in the heart of their range. So it makes sense. If we looked at something like a polar bear, this might be exactly the opposite of this, where they have lowest metabolic rate in the Arctic, where they're real adapted to. So pretty important where the species is within its range to understand this relationship. Another thing that is really important is what type of activity is being done. So you can see these different activities and how much they cost to transport based on the speed they're going and also the body mass. So you can study this to understand it. Notice that several activities might have this nonlinear relationship, like flying. It's optimal to be in the middle in terms of the energy cost for that. Also, the type of terrain that you're in, like whether or not it's steep snow, what kind of snow it is, those all affect how much energy is being used. Generally, activity uses at least 2 to 3 times as much energy as your basal metabolic rate. Another thing that's pretty important, and you may be experiencing this, you're trying to stay within your thermoneutral zone, and you have this lower threshold and this upper threshold that once you exceed those, your body starts having to work really hard to maintain your temperature. So you've moved out of your thermoneutral zone and you increase energy substantially to try to maintain that temperature. Notice with mammals, it's harder to maintain the cold than the hot, and part of that is because you're having to burn energy to create heat, whereas in this case you might carry out other activities such as sweating that could help you mitigate that temperature differential. Animals have all kinds of strategies to regulate their temperature. We know that reptiles, for instance, might sunbathe like this. You probably see that commonly. We also have things like shivering or piloerect feathers like going on in these pictures. You can see this one is for cold and this one's for hot. In both cases, they're trying to dissipate heat or keep from dissipating heat. So there's lots of different strategies. It'd be a good idea for you to know some of these strategies and look up some of those things. The life history strategy that the animal has taken from a reproductive standpoint could be pretty important as well. So if you have like an altricial, this is super altricial, so that means the young are born way before they can take care of themselves, right? So this is we're pretty close over here in the altricial or super altricial with humans because it takes a while before we get ready to live on our own, right? Super precocial is they're born and they're ready to go immediately, right? So when you increase the amount of parental care, you're increasing the investment that goes into raising that young. So the parental energy cost tends to increase as you go that. Another thing, small species tend to invest more than larger ones on a per capita basis. So for mammals, about 90% of the energy requirements during pregnancy actually occur during the last trimester. Okay, so 90% of the energy burned during during pregnancy happens just during that last third of it. Lactation, however, has the greatest energy cost of any condition in mammals. All right. So think about that for a minute. Most of the energy used in pregnancy is during that last trimester, but during lactation, that uses more energy than all of the pregnancy does. And in deer, for instance, it's more expensive than antler growth. It's more expensive than skeletal growth for the young. It can be up to 7 times basal metabolic rate, especially when the mammal has enough, basically the maximum amount of young that it can have. Like with deer, that typically is 2, can be 3, and with 3 in particular, we're probably near that 7 times basal metabolic rate in energy costs. Another thing that's pretty important in the wild is not all foods are created equal, right? So you can see the energy that's in different food components. Fat is very high in energy relative to some of these other things. Notice when we are talking about plants, seeds are really high in energy and compared to other parts of the plant. So that's pretty important for herbivores. And energy can vary widely even in the type of thing. So what you're looking at right here is an experiment that I carried out. Notice my pointer is right on that little vole that came into the picture. So we did this experiment with different kinds of acorns, and they have a wide variety in the amount of energy, and it was pretty cool to see. This was done during the winter when energy is really important. And the animals were actually selecting the acorns to remove them based on the amount of energy that was in it. So it was pretty cool. Hopefully you saw that little vole kind of pop his head up and grab it. I always thought that was awesome. I didn't even know they ate acorns, but he crawled around under there. Protein is something, especially in herbivores, that we will commonly try to measure in the environment, because energy, honestly, for herbivores is not that often limiting. Okay, protein is more widely regarded as a limiting factor to populations, and it's also relatively easy to measure. And protein is extremely important in a whole bunch of body processes in the animal. So it's a pretty good thing to to keep track of. Just to give you some examples, we talked about the life history mattering. When maybe you've seen turkeys with poults out in open fields, they're actually doing that to collect insects because the protein requirement of this poult, or in this case, a chick, is much higher than the adult. Typically, we see a divide like this during that time period, either during molting for the adult when they've lost their feathers and they're regrowing those feathers, or when they're actively growing skeletal growth, like the young are, we might see 75% or more of their diet be insects, whereas it might be mostly fruit and plant parts in other times of the year. This is actually a fetal growth scale for white-tailed deer, and it's actually pretty predictable for us. I like to throw it in there because the fetus grows at a defined rate, and we can actually tell how long the individual has been pregnant based on that. But it can be affected by the health of the parent, the lactation, or the pregnancy. The mother is drawing most of her protein from maternal stores, or most of the nutrients and everything as well, but a lot of it is coming from maternal stores for protein for sure. So just a little background on protein. There are about 25 amino acids, and these are the building blocks that make protein. It'd probably be a good idea for you to know some of these essential amino acids, because that might show up on an exam. That's a hint. But what does it mean to be essential? Essentially, what we're talking about is these are amino acids that cannot be synthesized in the body. So we have to get that through intake of food, right? Most of the other 25 can be readily synthesized by recombining constituents that are already in the body. So the body can actually create them. The essential amino acids are really important, and they're normally needed in animals that have a pretty simple stomach. So something like a white-tailed deer that has a really complex stomach, other herbivores, they might not have as many of these essential amino acids, but for us and a lot of other mammals, it's we do have essential amino acids. Generally, amino acids are somewhere between 8 and 19% nitrogen, and on average, that's 16%. So if you were going to actually try to estimate the amount of crude protein, you would just, because these are the building blocks and they're made of nitrogen, or a large portion of them, you would actually calculate that by multiplying that 16 time, or excuse me, you'd multiply n by the constant 4.25, which is just 100% divided by 16%, because about on average 16% of the nitrogen that is amino acids is actually or excuse me, you know what I'm talking about. You can see it on the slide. Deficiencies in a lot of things in the environment are not very common, especially minerals and vitamins. We don't see those in deficiency that often in nature. When you have animals in captivity, that becomes much more of an issue, and some of you that are interested in animal husbandry probably have already experienced this. You have animals that aren't being allowed to select their diet in the environment, and when you're doing that, you might be restricting them from getting some of their vitamins. But generally, we have two categories. We have water soluble versus fat soluble. The fat soluble, we're really good at storing those in the body. The water soluble, we have to constantly intake those, and they're not normally an issue because if we eat too many of them, we can just excrete them. However, with fat soluble, that can be much more of a problem. If we overeat in a particular nutrient, we can actually reach toxicity of that nutrient in that case, and that can be a problem. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes a little more. There's macro elements, which are greater than 1 milligram. There's also micro, which are less than a milligram per gram. You can see all these nutrients are used. The stoichiometry, in other words, the ratio of those nutrients could be important. Generally, calcium to phosphorus ratio is pretty important. In my experience, phosphorus is really commonly limiting for a really commonly limiting nutrient for herbivores, and we commonly will see them seek out that in the environment through diet selection. So we can see that happen. Sodium can be a problem for some ungulates like moose, and we see their diet selection actually shaped by concentration of sodium in the environment. Here are some of the trace elements and the things that they do. Again, they are generally only needed in a very small amount in the food. Here's a cool experiment. It's not working. Oh, there we go. That I did where we were actually trying to figure out whether or not deer could seek out nutrients. So in all these trays right here, you're actually seeing plants that are different species, and we knew that this guy was nutritionally stressed because he's growing antler, and you can see he's really not camera shy at all. But it was a pretty awesome experiment to me because we were actually able to figure out that they don't really care what the plant species is. They are using the nutritional composition of it to try to meet their nutritional demands. And you can see this guy's in really good health. He's also in captivity. But we were trying to provide the variety of plants that this guy needed so that he can meet his own nutritional demands. And it's pretty cool that they very actively will change their diet selection to meet whatever their limiting nutrient is at a given time. Here's actually one of the manuscripts that came from that. What we found was really cool. It's actually, they need to avoid nutrients that are abundant first, and then they secondarily try to maximize nutrient intake of the limiting nutrients. So think about that for a minute. Basically, that makes perfect sense biologically. If you eat too much of a nutrient and it becomes toxic, that will kill you, or it will severely cause a health problem. But you can miss a meal in most cases and be fine. So being in limitation for a nutrient for a little while is not detrimental to your health like the other. So it makes sense that diet selection would first be shaped by that upper threshold, don't reach toxicity in anything, and then secondarily try to meet the nutritional requirements of whatever your limiting nutrient is. So food quality is pretty hard to measure, and that's because it's so variable in the environment, especially for herbivores or frugivores. The plants vary widely in their nutritional composition, and they might, based on the age of the plant, so a new leaf generally is really high in protein, whereas that same leaf right before senescence might be really poor. Seeds typically are really high in energy and protein, but they're typically low in some of the other things like essential nutrients that you might need and essential amino acids. So the only way the animals really can meet their demands is to be highly selective and be in tune with what their body needs at any given time. And even in humans, there's been a really strong evolution for our body to provide digestive feedbacks so that we have cravings for foods that have particular kinds of nutrients. Now that has been muddied up just a little bit because some of the secondary plant compounds that we might use, we're going to talk about in a minute, to do that. And some of the nutrients that typically were very rare in the environment are now widely available to us and stripped away from some of the foods for the secondary plant compounds. So that makes it more difficult, but there's actually some really cool research on how well our bodies actually still are in tune with our dietary needs and how that can influence our own diet selection. So you should look into that. If you want to talk about that, you can definitely email me or ask about it, and I'm happy to give you more information about that. So for predators, it's not as important. They're really talking about quantity and not quality, and that's because if you're a predator of mammals, most mammals are pretty equal in terms of their nutritional demand. It's just a matter of how much of that you can intake, and you can see that the snowshoe hare, for instance, equals 49 voles approximately for a bobcat. So they probably would rather eat that snowshoe hare if they can catch it. But that's another thing that plays a critical role in this. For things that eat plants, we typically see this strategy where you have ruminants and they basically have a microflora in their stomach that are fermenting the plant material that comes in that's relatively hard to digest. There's a bunch of different kinds. I would suggest that you look these up, but basically the microbes ferment and digest the plants, and then the ruminant actually digests the microbes. So that's kind of a cool thing. But the important thing is that context matters a lot. And what I mean by that is depending on your nutritional demands and how much stress you're under and all these different factors in the environment, predation risk, all these things can shape what your body needs and how you decide to meet those needs in the environment. It's pretty important. Here's another pretty cool example for, we have a predator here, right? It's a mesocarnivore. This is a gray fox coming in and actually eating acorns, right? They typically would be eating prey species, but in some parts of times of the year, it's a little harder to find that, and they broaden their diet to meet those nutritional demands. You're going to see this was during February, during the middle of the environment. So here's again that vole. Again, when we change the forest type and what time of the year it is, it changes how they select these acorns during the year. So we actually see it reflected in nutritional demands. Another thing that you might notice in this picture, these things here, you see these little brown spots. Essentially, these are trees that are dropping acorns naturally in the environment, and that's animal use under it. You can actually see it from the air from a UAV. This the consequences of animals trying to meet their nutritional demand in the environment are pretty strong, and you can see all these trails from animals, and you can tell which trees were dropping acorns, and this has a real consequence to the way that this entire community functions. And when I say consequence, I don't mean negative or positive. I'm just talking about it changes the way, animals are dramatically changing the way the community functions as part of that community and when they are using these things. And here was a pretty cool study that I was involved with where we showed when we have trees with acorns on them, we increase animal activity substantially, and that actually changes the plant community richness around those. And what happens is we end up with these hot spots where we have this super intense use by herbivores, and because of that, we end up with these little patterns of herbivore resistant plants or herbivore dispersed plants that are concentrated in that. And then in the other areas, we have other plants. So when you collectively look at those together, they're actually more diverse because of this interaction between plants and herbivores in the system, which is pretty cool to think about. Diversity is absolutely essential to make sure we have this heterogeneity in the landscape. And this is just one really simple example of how that happens. Another thing for you to think about is, most things are trying not to be eaten. And I say most because there are instances where things are actively trying to be eaten if they're trying to infect or use the predator for some reason. But plants generally defend themselves with secondary plant compounds. And here are some different kinds. I would suggest that you understand, they talk about this in the book, understand some of these and what they're commonly found in. But essentially, these are things that the plant produces secondary to its own needs for growth and reproduction. So that's why it's called a secondary plant compound. And it's growing in secondary to that, and it's to defend itself from herbivory or being attacked by things. So some of these you might recognize. These are actually also the things that we typically find in nature that we turn into medicine. Okay, so a lot of our pharmaceuticals are originally found in compounds that we find in a plant, and most of the time they are a secondary plant compound that the plant is actually using to defend itself. Now, there's a coevolution between animals and plants. So animals also have a lot of adaptations to deal with some of these secondary plant compounds. And here's an example of a deer on that same experiment. These acorns actually vary in their level of tannins, and the deer doesn't even care, right? So some of them are really high and some of them are really low, but the deer is so well adapted to that that it actually doesn't even influence selection anymore. The deer has a really strong uh, compound in its saliva that binds protein, or binds the tannins to release those proteins to the animal. So the deer in this case is actually winning that evolutionary race, although the tannin level in the acorn might be really effective against some other types of predators. So this is what I was talking about, the salivary proteins that can bind tannins, and a lot of our cervids in particular, so these are both cervids, they're ungulates, they are really well adapted to deal with plant defenses because they make their living on eating plants, right? So all of this is pretty important to understand when we're talking about a cost trade benefit ratio, how that influences management. Ultimately, cover and water are essential also. They're going to talk about this in the book a good deal, but I didn't want to have this lecture go on too long. All of these things factor into our habitat management strategies, and we start to understand situations that we see pretty commonly in the South like this. Most of the species that would be using pine forest in the South need a really well developed understory, and this is really poor habitat for most of them. And understanding how animals interact with their environment and understand food and cover relationships is essential for us to understand how to improve those habitat conditions for these species. All right, so I'm going to stop there. Go ahead and read the book chapter to pick up some of the other information, and I will talk to you all in the discussion. Appreciate it.